My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife, and we're happy to bring you our online programming. Um, we have today Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, and we have the authors of that book on here to present to you. We have Bob and Eric, who are both with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and Liz with Vermont Land Trust, who have put this new edition of the book together. And we're really excited to have them on board. And they'll do a little introduction about each of themselves before they do their section. And we ask that everybody keep their mics on mute so we don't have the background noise. We will take questions after each section, and you can type your questions into the chat box, and we will relay the answers that way and try and have a little conversational, but not too crazy. I think that's all I need to start with. Oh, I am going to start with. I love this book. First of all, I want to tell everybody it's a really interesting way. But when it first came out, I had relocated back to Vermont, and I picked it up to read it, and learned it was not a book to read. It truly is a field guide. It's a field guide to our natural communities, and if you use it as a field guide, you will get so much out of it. And having them share with us how they developed the book and what's in the book is so exciting to me today. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Liz to start out with and share with us a little bit about Wetland, Woodland, Wildland.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to share my screen now and hoping that everybody can see this. Can you verify, Lisa, that you can see my screen and the front cover of the book now?
Yep, we're all set.
Great. All righty. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see everybody, and especially nice to see you on this beautiful day when I'm sure you'd rather be outside. And as Lisa said, you can do that right after this. We're really delighted to share this with you. We had the opportunity to share this with some in-person audiences before the pandemic, and we're delighted to be able to do it this way now. So we're going to talk about the new edition of Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, and a little bit about what's new in this edition, and then each of the three of us will talk about some of the natural communities with which we are especially intrigued and interested, and so it's not just sort of a tour, but it's also hopefully you'll learn something from this. And as Lisa said, it's not a book to read cover to cover like a novel, but really just open it up where you're interested and look for things that are interesting to you and explore it like a field guide. So what's new in this edition? First of all, I'll start by saying this is a collaborative effort between the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, the Vermont Land Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy has been involved with this project way from the very beginning, from the first publication of the book in 2000, and well before that, as the first edition was being developed. Vermont Land Trust is my employer. Fish and Wildlife has been a key partner in this all along. So this is a group of people. I want to just emphasize that this is a really collaborative effort, and it's not just us three authors, but it's really a collaboration of a lot of different people. And these are just some of the large number of people who have helped us over the years understand natural communities and help us gather more information. So what's new in the new edition? Well, one of the things is that Bob Zaino is our third author now. It's been a real pleasure to work with him. He'll be the next person up to speak, and he really has brought a wealth of knowledge and experience. He's been doing natural community mapping on state land since 2009, is incredibly knowledgeable. As we were editing the book, looking very in great detail at every sentence in the book, every word in the book. Often Bob would come to a passage in the book and he would say, is that really true? He would ask questions about things we had written back in 2000. So it was great to have his questioning mind and really generosity of spirit too, as he asked those questions. We had a lot of fun exploring the answers to those questions. So this is going back. This is just to show you a little bit about the history. Hopefully you can see my cursor, but these were some of the first early publications on the natural communities of Vermont beginning in the 1980s and early 90s. The work began actually at the regional level, at the Nature Conservancy's regional level. And I was brought on in 1984 to do natural community work in Vermont and develop our classification. So those are early publications. And then here's the first edition of the book. And here is also the first edition, but a second printing in 2005. And you can see actually the spine is a different color just to indicate that. But all we did there was to correct some typographical errors. And here we have the third edition of the book just published at the end of last year. So just to define a natural community is an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. Summary of what's new in this book. We've got 17 new natural communities. They've always existed. We just didn't have enough information on them before. There's one new biophysical region. Eric will talk about that. More emphasis on climate change and its implications for conservation. New information on wildlife habitat, new geology maps, lots of new photos, thanks to many of our colleagues, and enhanced community profiles. So here's one of the new geology maps. There was a similar map to this in the first edition, but thanks to our colleague Gus Goodwin and also Dan Farrell and just retired state geologist Margie Gale, this is a new ecological classification of the bedrock of Vermont. So in this map, you can see, just to summarize, the blue areas are areas of calcareous or limey bedrock, lime-rich bedrock. And these are places where the diversity of species is especially high. And then in the Green Mountains and the northern Green Mountains and the southern Green Mountains, we have rock that is sometimes calcareous, but not usually. And then the green is granite or other plutonic rocks, and these are not areas that are generally not calcareous. So they have a different flora and a different set of natural communities. I'm going to focus on a couple of natural communities that are found in the limestone areas. And if we look at a regional map, we can see in this map, this is the Nature Conservancy's work, that here's the limestone areas are shown in yellow on this map. And you can see looking at this map that actually there's not a lot of limestone region-wide. We have some of the largest areas of limestone and calcareous bedrock in the region. And we feel therefore that we have a responsibility to take good care of it. So I want to show you something that is in the book, and this is in the very back of the book now. I'll hold it up so you can see. The very back of the book is this key to the natural communities of Vermont. This is not new. This was in the earlier edition, but it's now more accessible there in the back of the book. And so you'll see this key as we go through. I'm going to start with northern hardwood forests. And this is a rich northern hardwood forest, a forest of sugar maple. There's a big, huge sugar maple tree. It's the photo by Bob Zaino, and nettles, wood nettles on the forest floor. Many of us are just enamored of these natural communities. And right now, these are great places to go to see spring wildflowers. And here's a group of students from the University of Vermont digging a soil pit in the rich northern hardwood forest. You can see from the soils, they're nice, dark, loamy soils, very enriched. And there's actually a couple of rare plants, by the way, in this picture. There's Goldie's wood fern. Here's Gifford Woods, which is an old growth rich northern hardwood forest in Killington. This is a really great place to visit because it's incredibly easy to access right on Route 100 in Killington. And in this old growth forest, you'll see lots of down trees, standing snags. And in there, I saw the evidence, I visited in the winter, of this plant, blue cohosh, which is shown here in fruit. And this is an illustration by Betsy Brigham. But it's right now, blue cohosh is in flower in our rich northern hardwood forest. So go out there and see it. Large flowered bellwort, one of my favorite plants. Plantain leaf sedge, also in full flower right now. Maidenhair fern, which is actually not fully out yet. This would be in May that you'd see this. And toothwort, two-leafed toothwort. And one of the interesting things I learned about toothwort is that there is a butterfly, the West Virginia white, which is whose caterpillar stage is strongly associated, actually completely dependent upon toothwort. And here is the West Virginia white on another plant, on the Dicentra, a Dutchman's breeches or squirrel corn, but its caterpillar phase relies on the toothwort, which is in bud right now. Okay, I want to switch over to a kind of a fun inventory story. This is a photograph that Bob Popp took back in 2010. And back in aging myself now, back in 1984, a botanist friend and I, this is a very rare plant called sticky false asphodel. Can you see the sticky part of the stem, the sticky little glands on the stem? We knew that there had been a collection of this on the White River in Sharon, and we didn't know where. But Peter Zika, the botanist, and I were driving around in the Sharon area one day on the White River, looked across the river and saw some really interesting ledges, and we decided to go and visit them to see what we would find. And so we put on our bathing suits and swam across the river through a rather swift current, I must say, and clambered up on the other shore, and this is what we found. We also found shrubby cinquefoil. We also found Culm's lobelia, beautiful little plant, Garber's sedge, capillary beakrush, an extremely rare plant. And this was the first instance that we knew of in Vermont called Calcareous Riverside Seep, a very rare natural community now protected and managed by the Nature Conservancy. Okay, another one of my favorite limestone natural communities, Limestone, Bluff, Cedar-Pine Forest. Actually, I will just pause here for a second. This is an illustration by Libby Davidson. Her beautiful line drawings are just gorgeous, and she has colored some of them. That's one of the things that's new in the new edition. She has hand colored some of them. I don't know if you can see me, but I've got the illustration actually is framed right behind me. And these are wonderful illustrations. So these are places where northern white cedar kind of clings to the cliffs on the edge of the lakeshore. Really amazing natural communities that withstand a lot of disturbance, including ice accumulation in the winter. Some of the interesting plants: maidenhair spleenwort, limber honeysuckle, ebony sedge, bunch of rare plants. Each of the natural community profiles has lists like this of rare and uncommon plants and animals, in addition to common ones. So you can find that. And ram's head lady slipper is one of the rare plants in that natural community. Just inland from the Limestone Bluff Cedar Pine Forest, you might find the dry oak maple limestone forest, which is a new natural community that we've described in this edition. Here's something that's flowering right now, bloodroot, which grows in this natural community, occurs in this natural community, and is flowering right now. Hepatica, also flowering now, leatherwood, and bubblet bladder fern. And this is an interesting animal that is associated with these natural communities, the American giant millipede, which relies on calcium to build its exoskeleton, which protects it from desiccation and from predation. All right, I'm going to go to hardwood swamps now and just talk about one more natural community, the northern hardwood seepage forest. And I want to recognize Hannah Phillips, who did some work for us a couple of years ago for the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Land Trust on our Atlas timberlands. And she, in the course of her work, she learned a lot about this natural community and really helped us understand it better. Sometimes they're closed canopy like this, and sometimes they're very open, but always wet and seepy. And trees tend to, because of the shallow soils, trees tend to fall easily. This is John Binhammer of the Nature Conservancy. And they're the first places to green up in the spring, so bears love these places. Some of the plants: foam flower, water avens, and bog candles, and thanks to Hannah Phillips for this photo. So those are some of the natural communities that feature calcareous soils or limestone, and some of my favorites. And we're going to pause now for a question or two if you have them.
So Liz, there's one question already in the chat box, and someone was wondering, it looks like Jock, is the TNC mapping tool available for use by the public?
Yes, it is.
Some of those.
Yeah, I'm going to just put on, yes, Jock, it is. I would just Google TNC resilience, and you'll get right to that information. Perhaps Bob or Eric might have more specific information about how to get to that.
I think that's right, Liz. You get to a map tool. There's a map tool at TNC Resilient Sites.
Yeah, it's an interactive map tool. So, yeah. And I would also, while you're mentioning that, Jock, I would also put a plug in for Vermont Conservation Design, which is complementary mapping effort that's at the state level. And perhaps Bob will talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, anything else?
Nope, not yet.
Great. Okay, let's go on to Bob. Bob, you're up. I've got to stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing yours.
All right, well, hello, everyone. Again, my name is Bob Zaino, and I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. My work is largely focused on the state-owned lands, so our state parks, state forests, and wildlife management areas. I'm lucky enough that for my work, I get to go out to those properties and explore them for natural communities. But I wanted to start my section here far away from Vermont with this picture that's from the Boreal Forest in Quebec. And the Boreal, let's see, there we go. The Boreal Forest is, I think, one of the world's largest ecosystems or biomes, depending on how you want to call it, spanning the whole circumpolar region. You can see this map here, and you can see that there's a red star down here for Vermont, and that we're not in the Boreal Forest, but we have these places, these natural communities that really have affinities to this region. And I've been lucky enough to travel to the Boreal Forest some and see the places further north, and I've found it really neat to see that in Vermont you don't have to travel far to see places that have some of those same special characteristics. So I wanted to share some of those today. And I wanted to start with kind of keeping with Liz's theme of limey, rich places with rich bedrock, but taking it and kind of putting it on ice. And this community is the Boreal Calcareous Cliff Natural Community. It's cold cliffs that are found. Oh, this is the key that Liz showed in the back of the book here, and this is really helpful if you want to figure out if you're out in the field with the book and you've stumbled across something like a cliff and you quickly want to figure out where to go. So you can see we're in the cliffs and talus section here. This is a community that's mostly restricted, not surprisingly, to the northern Green Mountains region of Vermont and the Northeast Highlands. There's good examples of this community at Lake Willoughby, the cliffs that you can see from Route 5A there. Other examples around the state, but my personal favorite is the cliffs at Smuggler's Notch, which I imagine many people have had the opportunity to drive through the notch and see those cliffs. When you get up close to them, they look more like this. They're often very densely vegetated, and you can see the water dripping down the cliff. So these are not in places that have that extremely rich, this Smuggler's Notch that is not in a place that has that extremely rich bedrock. It's not in the blue areas of the map that Liz was talking about, but there are these thin bands of calcium in the rock. And what happens is that as that water, which comes from the abundant rain and snow and fog that you get on our highest mountains, as it's dripping over the cliffs, it's picking up that calcium and carrying it down the face of the cliff. And as a result, you get plants growing on these cliffs that occur almost in no other natural communities in Vermont. This plant is butterwort. It's a carnivorous plant. It's kind of like flypaper. Insects come in and they get stuck to the leaves and then slowly digested. You can actually see there are crane fly parts. You can see some legs here stuck onto this plant. So we're watching plant digestion in action, I think. Depending on the size of your screen, this thing is probably larger than life, so don't fear encountering one of these out there. Another great plant of these cliffs is purple mountain saxifrage. and white mountain saxifrage. It's a mountain saxifrage named after its flower color, not the White Mountains of New Hampshire. You can see it has white dots on the edge of its leaves, and those are calcium crystals. It's actually picking up calcium and extruding it to the edges of its leaves. Fragrant fern, which is a cliff that lives in overhangs where calcium seeps out of cracks. And pale painted cup, a relative of the Western Indian paintbrush. And this is, of course, not a plant, but peregrine falcons are really charismatic dwellers of these cliffs, nesting on these inaccessible ledges. So getting up to see all these things on these cliffs is not really an easy task. It's very vertical and a little different than most other natural community inventory, but I think inventorying this community and all of our natural communities is really important, and it's because collectively natural communities describe the majority of the habitats for our native plants and animals. And if we can understand where all these plants and animals are and can understand all the natural communities that they're in, we have an efficient way to think about conserving all of their habitats. We don't need to find every species that might be in this natural community. There's some 20 to 40,000 species in Vermont. But if we can understand many of them and understand these places, we can conserve them as a way to, if we conserve some cliffs, some forests, some woodlands, some rock outcrops, and so forth, wetlands. By the time we've added all those up, we've conserved the majority of the habitat for all those species. A good example of some of the value of inventory these places is the story about this plant, the lance-leaved arnica. It's a plant that was seen in Smuggler's Notch, or maybe just near Smuggler's Notch, 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. It was collected. There's this specimen in the Harvard herbaria with an intriguing note: brookbed northeast shoulder of Mount Mansfield above Smuggler's Notch. So when I'm in these cliffs and the places around these cliffs, I'm looking for this plant. The habitat is exactly right. It should be easy to find. It's 2 feet tall and bright yellow. But then this is what that looks like. And can you imagine somewhere in there might be a 2-foot tall yellow flower? It makes me think about just how wild these places are, even when they can be small and compact. That plant, by the way, hasn't been seen in that 100 years. And I like to think that it's still up there, thriving, free from any eyes of scientists or explorers. This is elephant head buttress, a prominent feature in the notch. And this is elephant head buttress in the middle of winter. You can imagine winter's pretty harsh up in the mountains. The snow and the ice, the wind, the rime that covers everything. The plants have some cool adaptations. Here's that white mountain saxifrage again. It turns out that it can photosynthesize anytime the temperature gets up above freezing. So in this photo, it's probably producing energy. And that those calcium crystals, those white dots on the leaf edge, are actually helping it optically bring in light and maximize its photosynthesis. I have no understanding of the physics behind that, but that's what scientists report happening, and I think that's really neat. So it's getting every little advantage that it can in this harsh place. If you go, I don't know, 600, 700 miles north, you can find similar cliffs with similar species in the Boreal Forest region, and this cliff has many of those same species, like the white mountain saxifrage. I think many people know Mount Mansfield, and it's been an attractive place for people for a long time. This painting from 1858 by Thompson, who I believe is no relation to Liz, shows how long this mountain has been attracting people and a subject of drama. In reality, the mountain is maybe not quite so dramatic. This is the illustration by Livy Davidson that's showing 2 natural communities in the book. The perspective is a little more natural, but I don't think it loses any of the impressiveness of Mount Mansfield. The Alpine Meadow Natural Community, which you can drive to on the toll road to the summit, so everyone should take the opportunity to go explore this place. You know, no trees, a really different world low cushion plants like Diapensia, alpine bilberry here with the flowers, and black crowberry, this small shrub. We have, I think, somewhere just over 100 some acres of alpine meadow in Vermont. We have much less of perhaps our rarest natural community, alpine peatland, which we can probably measure in the state in square feet. This community is these tiny little wet pockets in the alpine zone on Mount Mansfield, only on Mount Mansfield, not even, we don't have these even on Camel's Hump or other alpine mountain. They can be really wet and fen-like you see in this picture with standing water, or they can be bog-like where the sphagnum and the shrubs form this sponge that you could walk on and it would be squishy, and you know you're in a wetland, but you'd never see standing water. You have to look close to see plants. Some of the plants there are low elevation species, but they only grow a few inches tall. Like here we see leatherleaf and Labrador tea. And I think there's some black crowberry hiding in the lower right of this picture too. You might also see evidence of one of the common mammals above tree line, the snowshoe hare. And many people go hiking up in the alpine zone on Mount Mansfield, and it's some days on busy summer weekends, it feels like a small congested place. On the long trail, there's markers and string to help keep people on the trail. And this picture to me just sums up why that's so important. This little area here that I'm showing with the cursor, hopefully you can see that, is an alpine peatland. And there's a little more alpine peatland over here. And the long trail runs right through it. And it's marked on the edges with this string. It probably was all alpine peatland, and that the soil has been eroded away and that where the trail is. But it shows just how important it is to stay on the trail and avoid stepping on some of our rarest and most sensitive habitats in the state. And again, making some connections to places up north. Here, alpine peatlands are one of our rarest communities, but in the mountains of central Quebec, alpine peatland is the dominant natural community. It sprawls over acres and acres and acres. You can walk for kilometers and your feet will just get wet and wetter. Here you can see some of that setting. But you don't have to go to Quebec to see places like this. You can see alpine peatlands on Mount Mansfield. The last natural community I want to talk about is not associated with high mountains or cliffs that are hard to get to, but it's in the lowlands. And we have cold boreal influenced places in the lowlands because cold air is heavy and it sinks. And I think people who live in cold valleys know this. On those still winter mornings, the cold air sinks down, and some of the coldest temperature readings are in the lowlands. And on our northern rivers, in the very northeastern part of the state, we get floodplain forests that are very unlike any other floodplain in Vermont. Typically, a floodplain might have towering silver maples or elms that arch up over an understory of almost unbroken ferns. But as you can see in this illustration, here we have spruce spires and trees that you won't find in other floodplains like balsam fir, northern white cedar, white spruce, black ash. Here's showing that distribution map from the book. And Emma Stuhl created all these maps for the book, and we really appreciate the work that she did to digitize all that knowledge into these easy to read maps. The boundaries on the map are biophysical regions, which Eric is going to talk about a little bit more next. So here we are with floodplain forests. You can see how we are in the book, and if you're looking through this, you can kind of use this almost like a simple dichotomous key, even though that's not entirely how it works, but you can say, oh, it seems like I'm in a wetland, I'm in a forested wetland, and then you can choose among those four types to help get you close to which community you might be in. Here's a picture of a floodplain forest, more real life. One of the neat things about this community is there's this zone along the edge that's not forested. It's dominated by mostly herbs, maybe a few shrubs, and I think it's there because of ice scour every spring. Trees just can't take hold in that immediate edge of the stream. This is Steam Mill Brook in Walden, and this is the Nulhegan River up in the Northeast Kingdom. Other species you might see in this floodplain are speckled alder, a wood turtle, uncommon species in Vermont. And maybe if you're lucky, a Canada jay. Used to be called gray jays, and they just changed the name recently. So here's another northern picture. This is Labrador, and you can see maybe the species are a little different because now we're getting quite far north, but the patterns are the same. We're in spruce country and large ice scour meadows on the edge of this good-sized river. And the ecological processes that are driving these places are pretty much identical. And it's neat from just kind of a exploration perspective to go and find places here in Vermont that are not really characteristic of our state, but have a lot in common with other places. It's also, I think, really important, maybe even more important from a conservation perspective, when we think about climate change and Vermont changing. And we've seen those maps of, you know, the simplified map of Vermont maybe moving down to North Carolina or something. And that's not really a good representation of how climate change is going to work maybe, but it does show that things are going to be radically different. Even as things change in Vermont, we know that there's going to be variation within our state, and that some places will be warmer and some places will be colder. And we can look to things like boreal calcareous cliffs and alpine peatlands and these boreal floodplain forests and know that in the future, they're always going to be different, and they're probably always going to support different species than the rest of the state. And if we think about long-term conservation, protecting these places, protecting that variety, whether it's cold places or warm places and so on, helps ensure that we'll have a diversity of plants and animals for the future. So with that, I want to say thanks and ask if there's any questions.
So you can go ahead and type any questions into the chat box. If anybody has any questions at this point, we'll give it a minute and see if anybody pipes in there. I'm going to ask while we're waiting, Bob, do you have a favorite natural community?
It would be one of those three. I really don't want to have to choose.
All right.
Probably
well,
boreal.
Probably
Boreal
boreal.
calcareous if I have to, if you're going to make me.
Okay. All right. So Jason's asking, do you know if the ice beds in White Rocks Recreation Area in Wallingford are one of those areas?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really neat spot that I've heard about and I haven't been to. I think that community is what we describe in the book as a cold air talus natural community. And it has many of the same species. It probably has, at least other cold air talus places in the state have black spruce, Labrador tea. Maybe there's some other species that are characteristic that I'm not thinking of offhand. But it's a very similar process. It's on those big talus slopes like White Rocks has. Cold air, the warm air rises and the cold air sinks, so the base of the cliff becomes very cold and supports different species. I don't know if Eric and Liz want to jump in with anything else about that place.
All right. James wants to know where they can buy the book.
Another great question. The book is available through Chelsea Green Publishing, and you can buy it online, but it's also available at most local Vermont bookstores, who hopefully are doing curbside pickup right now.
Yeah, definitely work on visiting those local bookstores. All righty. Well, it looks like you can turn it on over to Eric, I guess.
Right.
There's a great question. I'll let you, one of you answer and chime in while Bob switches his screen, and says, are there directions to find these communities in the book?
I can answer that if you want. This is in each natural community profile, there is, you can't really see it, but there is a section called places to visit. And so in each of those natural communities, there's different places where you can go and find those natural communities. It's not always, there's not explicit directions, but feel free to ask one of us, especially Bob and Eric, who can probably give you directions to those, specifically to those natural communities.
Great. Eric, I'm going to let you go. We're going to save the question in the chat box till when you're done.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Sorenson. I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I just wanted to start off by saying how appreciative I am, and I know Bob and Liz are too, of the organizations that we work for. Bob and I now for Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Liz for Vermont Land Trust, and actually both Liz and I worked for the Nature Conservancy when we did the first edition. And those organizations have been great in supporting us in doing this work, which sometimes felt like work and sometimes didn't. I also just want to say how happy I am, and how what a privilege it's been to work with Bob and Liz on this, because they've been just great to work with. So I want to jump around a little bit like Liz and Bob did too. I want to tell you a little bit about Oaky Forests and about the new Champlain Hills Biophysical Region. I want to explain a little bit how we added animals to this edition more than last time and why we did that. And I also want to explain a little bit about two broad classes of swamps, those that are associated with seepage and those that are found in closed basins. So I'm going to start off by talking about oak pine forests, oak pine northern hardwood forests. This is a shot of Ball Hill Dam down on the West River, Ball Mountain Dam on the West River. And the photos taken from the air, and the brown color, this is an October flight, and you can see oaks here, and you can see hemlock probably in a lot of these other areas. We do inventories of natural communities statewide, and we've done that for years. Liz started doing that work in the 80s, and I worked on it in 90s through now, and Bob's been doing it too. The importance of us doing inventories is it gives us more information so that we can refine our classification and provide information about why these places are so important. And the process of doing an inventory is first conducting a sort of a landscape assessment around the state of where we might find the target communities, like this case, oak forests. Doing aerial flights sometimes to zoom over them like this and get a quick view so we can better evaluate which sites we want to get to, contact landowners and make sure we have permission to visit their sites, and then get out and do field work, the fun part. And part of that process is the flights. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the flights. This is in the upper photo is Ian Worley. He's a professor and ecologist and pilot at University of Vermont, and Brett Engstrom, an ecologist that's worked for years in Vermont. And I had the privilege of flying many times with Ian on these kind of inventory projects. The map on the right shows the lines are 3 different days, different colored tracks, and the red spots are places we were aiming to get to, those oaky forests. And this just provides this great way to get around and see many places very quickly. 3 days we covered most of the state. Just take a look at how zig and zagging most of those paths are. You get a really unique perspective from the air. You get to see so much more. In this image, you can see in the background the montane spruce fir forest at the top of the mountain, the Green Mountains, expanses of northern hardwood forest, and then you get, as you get over, this is a view from the Champlain Valley looking east. As you get over closer to the escarpment, you see hemlock forests, open talus, and bedrock crops, and places where you've got some patches of oak. So you can pick these communities, many of the communities out from the air like this, and it's why doing these inventories is really helpful. This is a view of the West River, again, looking at those oak forests. And this is one of those situations where the plane is tipped up on edge. And I love flying, but I always have had trouble getting sick in flights. And this was one of those settings where you get sick, and you can picture, or I get sick, you can picture it even more when you're looping around on these tight loops around a site and trying to take pictures and take notes. I found this photo in that same inventory set of files, and I don't know why I kept it, because it's so blurry, but it does kind of remind me of how I feel during some of those inventories. The best part of inventory work, of course, is getting out on the ground. This is a visit to the North Pollitt Hills with Bob Zaino, Bob Pop, and Charlie Hone. And it's looking at an area of dry oak woodland, sort of an open woodland community, and then this temperate acidic outcrop. If some of you haven't been to the North Pollitt Hills, there's some great preserves there, friends of haystack, and wonderful trails, and just a great part of the state. It's down in Rutland County. I wanted to just go through a couple of the Oaky natural communities. Dry oak hickory hop hornbeam forest has those species as trees, but has this cool lawn of woodland sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. Dry pine oak heath sandplain forest. This is a very rare community restricted to the deep sands on glacial deltas, mostly in Colchester, but a couple other places around Chittenden County. This one was set on fire as part of a prescribed burn to try to restore some of the natural process. And a new community for the book, one that I wanted to share a little bit more about, and a favorite of mine, is dry red oak white pine forest, an open forest of red oak and white pine in varying amounts. It can be very open like this, mostly dominated by white pine and large areas of outcrop, or it can have a more closed canopy. The soils are generally very thin. Sometimes this is probably a deep soil for this community, but they're well drained, giving you that orange color a little bit down where the soils are highly oxidized. And some of the common plants in this community, maple leaf viburnum, bracken fern, blue stem goldenrod, low sweet blueberry, pink lady slipper. And it's a very species poor community, but that's part of its charm, I think, is that it has just a few species that are reliably found there. It's almost always on southern exposures, and it's one of the places where northern red oak, our red oak, gets as far north in the state as in any other community. If you drive along the Route 89 corridor from Montpelier to Burlington and look north, there are a lot of small knobs, rocky knobs, and almost every one of those knobs where you see oak is this dry red oak white pine community. One of the bird species associated with this is pine warbler. It's one of the first migrants here, and it likes tall white pines. I wanted to say a few things about Libby Davidson. That's Libby on the screen there. She's the artist that did most of the illustrations in the book, almost all but one of the natural community illustrations. And she was just dynamite to work with and incredibly patient with the three of us. Every community she visited, and one of the three of us would take her to a site, and she would always bring her stool, sit down, do some quick sketches like this one, take some photos, and within a week or so, she would send us back a first draft illustration. And on these, we would write notes. I don't know if you can read my notes on the left here. I say, need a flagged white pine. Somewhere add a red oak up close. And she would take our notes like that, and sure enough, there's the flagged white pine. Here's a red oak leaf up close, and turn them into these illustrations that are really better ways of depicting the community we want to show than you could show in a photo. Again, she was just great to work with. So biophysical regions are regions of the state that have similarities within each biophysical region. So a biophysical region has fairly consistent vegetation, climate, elevation ranges, landforms, bedrock, sometimes surficial deposits. And this new bedrock, or this new biophysical region map that we have results from work that Liz and Charles Ferree did. And the new biophysical region, again, new in that we've just recognized it now, is this area called the Champlain Hills. And it's intermediary between the Champlain Valley and the Northern Green Mountains. It's a biophysical region with three large rivers flowing through it, the Missisquoi, the Lamoille, and the Winooski. It has low hills, and it is warmer than the Green Mountains, and it's moister than the Champlain Valley. We get most of our winds from the west, the prevailing winds, and as those winds come across the Champlain Valley and then rise into the Champlain Hills, they cool, and so they drop more precipitation on the Champlain Hills than they do in the Champlain Valley. This is just a view of, in Westford, looking west along the Lamoille River. And you can see the broad river valleys, the dominance of spruce northern hardwoods, and little bits of oak. Hemlock is also common in this region. So it's helpful to have this biophysical region. It helps us refine how we go about conservation. In the northern part of the biophysical region, there's some really cool boreal peatlands, like this Franklin Bog it's really a poor fan owned by the Nature Conservancy. So I want to jump to a couple swamps, the hardwood swamps and softwood swamps, and talk about some of the changes that we've made. In the 2000 edition of the book, we had a community called Red Maple Black Ash Swamp. And what we've learned from the inventories is that that was too broad. It includes too much variation to be an effective tool for conservation, in that the variation was fairly extreme. So in this edition, we've split that into two types. One called Red Maple Black Ash Seepage Swamp, and one Red Maple Sphagnum Basin Swamp. And it's really pretty amazing how few species there are in overlap between these new two communities. Red maple is for sure, but you don't find black ash in the basin swamp, and you find a little bit of sphagnum, but only a few species that are associated with seepage. So the overlap in species is very different. Just show you a couple images of what the red maple black ash seepage swamp looks like. It has black ash. Here's a very large black ash. If you look at the ground, there's often lots of moving water, and you can see sort of abundant herbs and mosses like this. There are species that are indicative of groundwater seepage, like this swamp saxifrage, or here a moss, shaggy moss, the genus Rididiadelphus, and the plant in the foreground, naked miterwort. A similar process we did with hemlock swamps. That was the name we had in 2000, and we split that into two types: hemlock, balsam fir, black ash seepage swamp, and Hemlock-Sphagnum basin swamp. And here I just want to show you what the basin swamp looks like. It's dominated by a ground cover of sphagnum that sort of rolls over these hummocks and hollows. There are a few wispy areas of three-seeded sedge. It's shady and dark. They typically have deep peat. They typically also have very small watersheds, so that there's often no inlet stream and no outlet stream, but just a basin that holds water throughout most of the year, holds water in saturated peat. Last thing I want to tell you about is animals and how we added those to the book. I wanted to start with just a couple quick stories. This is actually an alder swamp near my place in Calais, but the story I wanted to tell you about was an alder swamp in sort of a wild part of the state, the Steam Mill Brook Wildlife Management Area. And I was up there working. I'm not sure why I was actually in the alder swamp, because I haven't done a lot of inventory work there. But I heard this crashing back and forth in the swamp, and actually turned out that this moose, not this particular one, but he was equally big with antlers, followed me back and forth across the swamp, I think 3 times. And the last time I decided I'd probably better leave. It was kind of a close encounter with a large moose. The only time I remember leaving an inventory site because of an animal other than yellow jackets. Another one was this site. It's called Little Vulture. That's the White River down below and the road that goes from Bethel to Killington. And this Little Vulture has one of my favorite communities, the dry red oak white pine forest on it, which is back from this cliff edge. And it's actually a pretty open red oak and white pine forest. And I was in there in this kind of late summer time, and 2 coyotes came trotting along the ridge. They were clearly upwind from me, and they were probably only 100 feet away, but trotting along with their tails high, not paying any attention to me, not knowing I was there. And it was, the special part is just seeing them in that sort of natural condition and unaware of me. They got downwind from me, quickly smelled me and came towards me, which was a little disconcerting, but all I had to do is bang my soil auger on a tree and they were off. Just a nice sighting. So wildlife habitat and natural communities. As Bob mentioned, the natural communities in Vermont, they really encompass all of the natural parts of the state, which is most of the state, 80% of the state or so. And each natural community provides the habitat for all of our native species, other than a few that might be associated with grasslands or aquatic species. And what we wanted to do is add animals that are associated with particular natural communities. The difference between using plants and animals in natural communities is that you can define a natural community by its plants because they're there, they're static, and they reflect the ground conditions and the moisture, that sort of thing. Wildlife is a little different in that some species are closely tied to a community and some are sort of, they're more loosely associated, or they use many communities because they range around the landscape. So an example of a close connection is white-tailed deer using hemlock forests for winter cover. Or this very rare, the smallest North American dragonfly, elfin skimmer, that is very tightly associated with wet, poor fens. Or this very rare, I think state threatened or state endangered, cobblestone tiger beetle that's associated with river cobble shores. And then there's some species that are more generalists, like this Blackburnian warbler that likes tall mixed forests of conifers and hardwoods. But the goal of this really was just to get more animals into the picture on how we look at natural communities. We're hoping that it gives people some more interest in how a community functions and how it supports all the species that we have here in the state. I wanted to end with just a reading of a portion of the vision for our vision for the future that's part of the book. Our vision for the future. We believe all organisms have intrinsic value and a right to survive. We also believe humans need a healthy environment to provide them with the basic physical needs like food, clean water, and shelter, and to sustain their spiritual and emotional health. Our vision of Vermont's future is a place where humans and nature coexist, and both are healthy. 100 years from now and beyond, we envision a Vermont with large areas of contiguous, unfragmented forest with its natural lakes, streams, wetlands, cliffs, and ridgetops. We envision riparian and upland habitat corridors connecting these large areas of contiguous forest, allowing unhindered movement of plants and animals. We envision a Vermont where both humans and nature are resilient. Even as unprecedented climate change stresses our world, we envision ecosystems still shaped by natural processes. Key to realizing this vision is a renewed and strengthened human commitment to the natural world. We envision Vermonters living in harmony with the natural world and enjoying its bounty well into the future. We hope that others share this vision, and we hope that this book helps us all achieve it. Thanks a lot, and the three of us are here and happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, there are some in the chat box, so let me get started. The one we left in the chat box before was from Steve, and he says, we hear a lot for resilience for human communities. Speaking of climate change, is there more our state should be doing to support resilience for natural areas?
Let me try to start. Earlier, I forget if it was Bob or Liz, I think Liz mentioned the Vermont Conservation Design, and that's a report and a project that I think Lisa put it up on the chat box, and you can view the reports at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department website. And there's actually a whole website called Biofinder that describes the mapping of that. The idea of that whole project is part of what Bob described of making way for all of the species we have now, those species that arrive as climate changes and those that move to the north as climate warms, making a place for them in the state. So it really is a vision for our state, something that it's our choice to make it happen on how we make our land, make the state resilient for climate change.
Hey, I will add, I don't know, Eric, there was a webinar on Biofinder recently. I think there's another one coming up, and Lisa Sawsville of Vermont Coverts, our host here, has a very comprehensive list of things that are coming up, and there may be one on Biofinder coming up. Is that right, Eric? Or Bob?
I think you're right. I think there are some that Jens and Andy Wood are putting on. Yes.
Yep.
Great.
So check that out.
Someone wants to know, Paula, how to find the peat bog at Snake Mountain in Addison.
Bob, you want to get that?
I guess so. On the internet, I don't think I can tell you that, but maybe some general tips for thinking about how to find interesting natural communities are the ways that the three of us find them typically, which is using tools like aerial imagery, like you'd get through Google Earth, using our cell phones as GPS devices, and also just spending a lot of time going out and exploring. That bog at Snake Mountain, I know, is a little sensitive, so I wouldn't really encourage a lot of trampling around to try to find it and get there. But in general, using those tools to find neat places is what we do, and it's kind of the way we hope that others will find these natural communities.
Great. There was a question from Margaret about prescribed fire. Eric, you had showed a slide with that, and she would like to know how often fires are prescribed in Vermont, and what's the history of using fire in Vermont to manage our forests?
Great question. It's funny, you'll hear Vermont referred to as the asbestos state because there aren't really very many communities that burn in Vermont. There are just a few exceptions. Red pine forests, where lightning strikes typically on ridges, are places where the fires occur. These dry sandplain forest in Chittenden County that the photo was is another one where they occurred in the past. With development around all those fragments of sandplain forest that we have now, natural fires don't occur. So it's a fairly rare event now for us to work on prescribed burns because it takes a lot of effort, just the right weather conditions, and there are a lot of safety precautions. Liz or Bob, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just caution that if you're, I've seen people use prescribed fire based on not very much information. So if you're interested in that, just please reach out to one of us or someone from the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation who has the expertise in knowing whether fire actually is a part of a natural community or not. There's new work out of Harvard Forest and elsewhere showing that the use of fire by native people is really much less than people have often thought. So it's not like it was used a lot by native people, even though that's a kind of a common understanding, especially in southern New England.
Great. Liza wants to know, can you speak more about what you mean by variation? And I'm going to tag on to that. Like, how big is a natural community? Because she was wondering, how much variation is considered before you split those natural communities? And did you join any natural communities as you were looking at them?
Another great question. Let me start. We actually split all of our 97 communities into 3 categories. One that's called small patch. They're really dependent on the local environment. Many factors come together, and they could be, a quarter of an acre up to maybe 10 acres, a little larger, 15 sometimes. Large patch areas that are sort of associated with one or a few environmental factors, and then what we call matrix forests. Those are like northern hardwood forests that sprawl over tens of thousands of acres. So a community can be any size. It's not really but it's helpful to think about them in terms of those size categories.
Great, great. Well, it's 3 o'clock. We've reached our hour. So I would like to thank our speakers for sharing with us about Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. You can find the book online as well as our local bookstores, and I encourage curbside pickup at our local bookstores. And we'd like to thank you all for being here. Vermont Coverts loves bringing these programs to you online. You certainly can support us by visiting our website at www.vtcoverts.org. And donations are always accepted, especially during these times. But this has been a great experience. Take the book out, take it into the field with you. It's kind of quite fun. As you hike up a mountain, it's a great way to see the transition between some of the different communities. That's like kind of one of the best ways to see it when you're first learning them. At least I think so. I'm going to give Eric, Bob, and Liz a chance to say anything in the end here, and I'd like to thank you all for participating.
I want to just say thank you to Lisa Sausville of Vermont Coverts for hosting this event. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's really, really wonderful to have you doing all of this great outreach work during this time.
Thanks.
Same for me, and thanks for everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Agreed. I hope everyone can get outside now and enjoy the day.
Thanks for that good work and for this delightful time with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.